How Silicon Valley's miracle blood test went from $9 billion to criminal fraud. There was a machine sitting in Walgreens pharmacy locations across America, sleek, compact, revolutionary, they said, a single drop of blood from your fingertip, and within minutes, it could run hundreds of medical tests. No needles, no vials, no lab technicians in white coats waiting weeks to call you back with results. But that machine had a secret so dangerous that when it finally unraveled, it would destroy a $9 billion company, send its founder to federal prison, and shake Silicon Valley's entire investment culture to its core. Only a handful of people inside the company knew the truth about what was really happening inside that machine, and what they knew would eventually make them choose between their careers and their consciences. One of them would become a whistleblower. But the move this person made was so calculated, so brilliant, that it bypassed every legal team, every powerful board member, and every threat the company could muster. We'll get to that decision in a moment, because that single phone call changed everything. But first, you need to understand how deep the deception went, how a Stanford dropout convinced some of the most powerful people in America, former secretaries of state, legendary generals, billionaire investors, that she had created technology that defied the laws of physics and chemistry, and how, for over a decade, everyone believed her. This is the story of Theranos, and trust me, what you think you know is just the beginning. Welcome to another deep dive into the stories that define our technological age. For years, Silicon Valley operated on a simple principle: fake it till you make it. Overpromise, underdeliver initially, then catch up with the hype using investor money and brilliant engineering. Facebook wasn't profitable for years. Amazon lost money for nearly a decade. Tesla burned through billions before turning a profit. But there's a line, a boundary that separates ambitious vision from criminal fraud. Theranos crossed that line, and they didn't just step over it, they sprinted past it, then built an entire corporate empire on the other side, while telling everyone they were revolutionizing healthcare. By 2013, Theranos wasn't just another Silicon Valley startup, it was valued at $9 billion. Its founder, Elizabeth Holmes, was on magazine covers. She gave TED Talks. She partnered with Walgreens and Safeway. She assembled a board of directors that read like a fantasy draft of American power. Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, James Mattis, William Perry. The promise was intoxicating. A world where you could walk into any pharmacy, prick your finger, and get comprehensive blood test results immediately. No more expensive lab visits, no more anxious waits. Democratized healthcare, accessible, affordable, immediate. There was just one problem. The technology didn't work, not in the way they claimed, not even close. And as the company grew, as more patients trusted their health to Theranos test results, the gap between what Elizabeth Holmes promised and what the Edison machine could actually deliver became a chasm. This episode will take you inside that chasm. We're going to trace the entire arc, from the dorm room ambition to the billion-dollar valuation, from the partnerships with America's largest pharmacy chains, to the moment when a handful of employees realized they were participating in something far darker than a failing startup. You'll learn exactly how the con worked, how Theranos manipulated test results, how they intimidated employees and journalists, how they used legal threats like weapons, and most importantly, how it all fell apart. Because there's something about this story that goes beyond one fraudulent company. Something that reveals a deeper sickness in Silicon Valley culture, a willingness to believe, to ignore red flags, to prioritize narrative over evidence. And here's the uncomfortable truth. It's still happening today. Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford in 2003. She was 19 years old. The story she told was compelling from the start. She was terrified of needles as a child. She watched family members struggle with serious illnesses. She wanted to make blood testing painless, accessible, revolutionary. One drop of blood instead of multiple vials. Hundreds of tests instead of a handful. Results in hours instead of days. It wasn't just a business idea, it was a mission, a crusade even. And in Silicon Valley, mission-driven founders get funding, especially when they're young, charismatic, and willing to make bold promises about changing the world. Holmes raised her first round of venture capital by 20. By her mid-20s, she had tens of millions in funding. By 30, she was a billionaire on paper. But here's what made Theranos different from other ambitious startups. Most tech companies are building software, iterating, testing, failing fast, and pivoting. If your social media app doesn't work perfectly, nobody dies. If your delivery algorithm miscalculates, someone's package arrives late. Theranos was playing with people's health. Blood tests inform life or death medical decisions. A false negative for cancer means delayed treatment. A false positive for HIV means psychological trauma and unnecessary medication. Incorrect cholesterol readings mean heart attacks that could have been prevented. The stakes were incomprehensibly high. And from the very beginning, the technology didn't work the way Holmes claimed it would. The Edison machine, named after Thomas Edison, was supposed to be the centerpiece of the revolution. Small enough to fit on a countertop. Sophisticated enough to run hundreds of tests from a single drop of blood. But former employees would later reveal something disturbing. The Edison machines were wildly unreliable. They produced inconsistent results. They couldn't actually run most of the tests Theranos advertised. And when they did run tests, the error rates were unacceptable for medical diagnostics. So what did Theranos do? They improvised. And by improvised, I mean they cheated. Instead of using their proprietary Edison devices, Theranos employees began running patient blood samples on traditional blood testing machines. The same commercial analyzers made by companies like Siemens that every normal medical lab uses. But there was a problem with that too. These traditional machines require more blood than a finger prick provides, so Theranos would dilute the samples. They'd take that single drop of blood, add saline solution to increase the volume, then run it through conventional machines. Any medical professional will tell you what happens when you dilute blood samples. The readings become inaccurate, unreliable, dangerous. But Theranos sent those results to patients anyway. To real people, making real medical decisions. One employee later testified about receiving quality control results that showed wildly inconsistent readings. Running the same blood sample multiple times would produce completely different results. In a functioning medical lab, that's a catastrophic failure. You shut down, you investigate, you don't send results to patients. Theranos kept sending results. And Elizabeth Holmes kept making promises, bigger promises, more audacious claims. She secured a partnership with Walgreens in 2013. Theranos wellness centers began opening inside Walgreens pharmacies across Arizona and California. Real patients, real blood, real consequences. She secured a partnership with Safeway. The grocery chain spent over $300 million renovating stores to accommodate Theranos testing centers. She appeared on magazine covers. Forbes called her the youngest self-made female billionaire. Fortune named her one of the world's most powerful women. The media loved her. A young woman disrupting a male-dominated industry. A Stanford dropout who walked away from privilege to pursue a mission. She wore black turtlenecks like Steve Jobs. She spoke in an unusually deep voice that made her seem more authoritative, more serious. Everything about her public persona was carefully constructed, but inside Theranos, things were falling apart. There's a question that every person who followed this story eventually asks. How did it go on for so long? How did nobody outside the company realize what was happening? The answer is both simple and disturbing. Theranos operated in absolute secrecy. They claimed their technology was proprietary, too valuable to share, too revolutionary to explain. They refused to publish peer-reviewed research. They refused to let outside scientists examine their machines. They hired lawyers, aggressive lawyers, and threatened anyone who asked too many questions. That should have been the red flag. In medical science, transparency isn't optional. It's fundamental. If you invent a new drug, you publish your clinical trials. If you develop a new diagnostic tool, you let other experts validate your work. Theranos refused every time, and somehow that refusal was interpreted as confidence rather than evasion. But here's where the story takes a turn, because eventually, people inside the company started realizing they couldn't stay silent anymore. The gap between the public promises and the internal reality had become too wide. Patients were receiving inaccurate results. Lives were potentially at risk, and that's when the whistleblowers began to emerge. What happened next would set off a chain reaction that even Elizabeth Holmes, with all her powerful connections and legal resources, couldn't control. But to understand how it all came crashing down, you first need to understand who was enabling this fraud in the first place. One of the most baffling aspects of the Theranos story is the board of directors. Look at the names: Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State; George Shultz, another former Secretary of State; William Perry, former Secretary of Defense; James Mattis, Marine Corps General, future Secretary of Defense; Sam Nunn, former Senator; Bill Frist, former Senate Majority Leader, also a physician. These weren't random celebrities lending their names for publicity. These were some of the most experienced, powerful, connected individuals in American political and military history. How did they all end up on the board of a medical technology startup? And more importantly, how did none of them realize they were endorsing a fraud? The answer reveals something crucial about how Theranos operated. Elizabeth Holmes didn't recruit medical experts to her board. She didn't bring in hematologists, laboratory scientists, or diagnostics engineers, people who would understand blood testing, people who would ask the right technical questions. Instead, she recruited prestige. She recruited names that would open doors, names that would make investors feel safe, names that would make journalists hesitate before writing critical stories. And it worked. When you're a reporter considering investigating Theranos, and you see that Henry Kissinger and George Shultz are on the board, you pause. You think, surely these distinguished statesmen wouldn't attach their names to a fraud. Surely they've done their due diligence. But they hadn't. Because they weren't scientists, they didn't understand the technology, and according to multiple reports and testimonies, the board meetings were carefully stage-managed. Elizabeth Holmes controlled the information flow. She presented rosy projections. She showcased carefully selected data. She deflected technical questions. And the board, lacking the expertise to challenge her claims, trusted her. There's a particular tragedy in George Shultz's involvement, because it was his grandson, Tyler Shultz, who would become one of the most important whistleblowers. We'll get to that story in detail soon, but the family dynamic here is devastating. Tyler Shultz joined Theranos enthusiastic and idealistic. He was proud his grandfather was involved. He believed in the mission. But after working there for months, he realized the technology didn't work. He saw the inconsistent results. He raised concerns internally, and when those concerns were dismissed, he went to his grandfather. George Shultz sided with Elizabeth Holmes. He believed her over his own grandson. The company's lawyers went after Tyler aggressively. They threatened legal action. They demanded he sign documents that would have bankrupted him. They tried to intimidate him into silence. And through all of it, his grandfather, a man who'd served multiple presidents and negotiated with foreign adversaries, couldn't see that the young woman in the black turtleneck was lying to him. This is the power of charisma combined with prestige. Holmes had cultivated relationships with these powerful men. She'd made them feel like they were part of something historic. She'd appealed to their egos, their legacies, their desire to be remembered for more than politics. And they wanted to believe her. There's a psychological phenomenon at play here. When you've publicly committed to something, when you've attached your reputation to a person or project, it becomes incredibly difficult to admit you were wrong. The cognitive dissonance is too painful, so you rationalize, you dismiss the critics, you trust the narrative you've already bought into. The Theranos board did this for years, but the board wasn't the only group of enablers. The media played its role too. For years, Elizabeth Holmes was media gold, a young female founder in Silicon Valley, a Stanford dropout success story, a mission to democratize healthcare. She gave great interviews, she had a compelling personal narrative, and journalists, especially in the tech press, were more interested in celebrating disruption than investigating claims. There were warning signs. Some journalists did ask tough questions, but Theranos would respond with legal threats, cease and desist letters. Aggressive lawyers from powerhouse firms like Boies Schiller Flexner, led by David Boies himself, one of America's most famous attorneys. Most publications backed off. The Wall Street Journal didn't back off. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about the partnerships. Because Walgreens and Safeway weren't just prestigious associations, they were real commercial deployments with real patients. Walgreens executives were excited about the partnership. They saw Theranos as a competitive advantage against CVS. They envisioned Theranos wellness centers drawing customers into stores. They rushed the partnership. But according to later reporting, Walgreens' own consultant, a laboratory expert they'd hired to evaluate Theranos technology, expressed serious concerns. The consultant couldn't verify the claims. The demonstrations were limited. The data was insufficient. Walgreens moved forward anyway. Why? Because they were afraid of being left behind. Because Theranos had created a sense of urgency. Because missing out on the next big thing felt more dangerous than rushing into a partnership without proper vetting. This is where Silicon Valley's move fast and break things culture collides catastrophically with healthcare. You can't move fast and break things when those things are human bodies. But Theranos did exactly that. By 2014, Theranos wellness centers were operating in dozens of Walgreens locations. Patients were walking in, getting finger pricks, receiving test results that were influencing their medical decisions. And behind the scenes, Theranos employees were panicking. They knew the results were unreliable. They knew patients were being harmed. But speaking up meant losing your job. It meant getting sued. It meant going up against one of the most well-connected companies in Silicon Valley. Most stayed silent. But not everyone. And the ones who didn't stay silent, the ones who decided their consciences mattered more than their careers, those are the people who ultimately brought Theranos down. What one of them did next was brilliant. It's the reason the entire fraud unraveled, because this whistleblower knew exactly who to call. Tyler Schultz wasn't the first employee to realize something was wrong at Theranos, but he became one of the most crucial whistleblowers. He joined the company in 2013, fresh out of Stanford with a biology degree. He was excited. His grandfather's involvement made him feel connected to something important. He believed the mission, but within months, he started noticing problems. Quality control tests were failing. The same blood sample would produce different results when tested multiple times. Proficiency testing, where external organizations send standardized samples to labs to verify accuracy, was being manipulated. Tyler raised these concerns with his supervisor, then with higher management. The response wasn't to investigate, it was to marginalize him. Theranos had a culture of secrecy that extended internally. Different teams were siloed. Employees weren't allowed to discuss their work with colleagues in other departments. Everything was compartmentalized, need-to-know basis. This wasn't just to protect trade secrets, it was to prevent anyone from seeing the full picture. Tyler Schultz saw enough of the picture to know something was deeply wrong. And when his internal complaints went nowhere, he made a decision. He reached out to New York state regulators, anonymously at first. He provided documentation. He explained the problems with Theranos' testing processes, and he reached out to a journalist, John Carreyrou at the Wall Street Journal. This is where the whistleblower's strategy becomes fascinating. Because Tyler understood something crucial. Theranos' power came from its reputation, from the prestigious board members, the glowing media coverage, the partnerships with major corporations. The only way to bring down Theranos was to destroy that reputation publicly. And the only publication with enough credibility and resources to take on Theranos' legal army was the Wall Street Journal. John Carreyrou had received a tip about Theranos from a medical professional. The tip suggested the company's technology didn't work as advertised. Carreyrou started investigating. He found Tyler Schultz. He found other former employees willing to talk. He started piecing together the story. But Theranos didn't go quietly. When Elizabeth Holmes learned that the Wall Street Journal was investigating, she went on the offensive. She called Rupert Murdoch, who owned the journal and was also a Theranos investor. She tried to get the story killed. It didn't work. She deployed David Boies and his legal team. They sent threatening letters to Carreyrou. They contacted his editors. They demanded to know his sources. The journal stood firm, and on October 15, 2015, Carreyrou's first story published. The headline, "Hot Startup Theranos Has Struggled with Its Blood Test Technology." The article was devastating. It detailed how Theranos was using traditional blood testing machines for most of its tests, not its proprietary Edison devices. It included quotes from former employees about quality control failures. It raised serious questions about the accuracy of results being sent to patients. Theranos' response was immediate and aggressive. Elizabeth Holmes went on CNBC. She called the article false and misleading. She insisted the technology worked. She positioned herself as a victim of a biased journalist. She published rebuttals on Theranos' website. She had prominent supporters defend her publicly. She tried to bury the story under a wave of counter-narrative. For a moment, it seemed like it might work, but Carreyrou kept publishing. More stories, more sources, more documentation, and then the dominoes started falling. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, launched an inspection of Theranos' laboratory. What they found was alarming, deficiencies so serious that patients were in immediate jeopardy. The inspection report, when it became public, was damning. Walgreens suspended its partnership, then terminated it entirely. The SEC launched an investigation, so did the FBI. Partners backed away. Investors demanded answers. The prestigious board members suddenly went quiet. And Tyler Schultz, the young whistleblower who'd sacrificed his relationship with his grandfather and spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on legal defense, was vindicated. But the personal cost was enormous. Theranos had targeted Tyler viciously. They hired private investigators to follow him. They threatened him with lawsuits that would have bankrupted him. His family had to hire lawyers. His grandfather still wouldn't believe him. Other whistleblowers faced similar treatment. Erica Chung, another young employee who'd worked in the lab, spoke out as well. She corroborated Tyler's accounts. She described the chaos in the laboratory, the pressure to hide problems, the manipulation of quality control data. There was also an older, more experienced whistleblower, a lab director who'd quit after raising concerns that were ignored. This person provided crucial documentation to regulators. Together, these whistleblowers did something extraordinary. They went up against a $9 billion company backed by some of the most powerful people in America. They risked their careers, their finances, their reputations, and they won. But here's the question that haunted many observers. Why did it take so long? Why did it require brave individuals risking everything to expose what should have been caught by regulatory oversight? The answer reveals systemic failures that go far beyond one fraudulent company. The FDA had limited jurisdiction over laboratory-developed tests. CMS inspections were infrequent and often superficial. Investors conducted minimal technical due diligence, trusting prestige over evidence. Media outlets celebrated disruption without skepticism. Theranos exploited every one of those gaps, and the cost wasn't just financial. Real patients received inaccurate test results. Some testimonies later revealed that people made medical decisions based on faulty Theranos data. How many people were harmed? We'll probably never know the full extent, but the legal consequences were just beginning, and what happened in the courtroom would reveal one final layer to this story, something darker about accountability and justice. By 2016, Theranos was collapsing. The partnerships were gone, the reputation was destroyed, the regulatory agencies were closing in, and the company that had once been valued at $9 billion was essentially worthless. In 2018, the SEC charged Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos president Ramesh Sunny Balwani with massive fraud. The charges were serious. Holmes and Balwani had allegedly raised more than $700 million from investors through false claims about Theranos' technology, business relationships, and financial performance. Holmes settled with the SEC without admitting guilt. She gave up control of the company. She paid a fine. She was barred from serving as an officer or director of a public company for 10 years, but the criminal charges were still coming. In June 2018, a federal grand jury indicted Holmes and Balwani on wire fraud charges. The indictment alleged they'd engaged in a multi-million-dollar scheme to defraud investors and a separate scheme to defraud doctors and patients. If convicted, they faced up to 20 years in prison. The trial didn't begin until 2021. COVID delays pushed it back repeatedly, but when it finally started, it became one of the most closely watched white-collar criminal trials in years. The prosecution's case was methodical. They brought in investors who testified about the claims Holmes had made, that Theranos technology was being used on military helicopters in Afghanistan, that Theranos was generating over $100 million in revenue, that pharmaceutical companies were validating the technology. All lies, the prosecution argued. They brought in patients who'd received inaccurate test results. One woman testified about receiving a miscarriage diagnosis based on a faulty Theranos test. She'd actually been pregnant. The incorrect result caused unnecessary anguish. They brought in former employees who described the dysfunction inside the company, the pressure to hide problems, the realization that patients were being harmed. The defense tried multiple strategies. First, they argued Holmes believed the technology would eventually work, that she was optimistic, perhaps overly so, but not fraudulent, that she genuinely thought Theranos was on the verge of breakthroughs. The prosecution countered with internal emails and documents showing Holmes knew about the problems and continued making false claims anyway. Then, the defense made a more controversial argument. They claimed Holmes had been abused and psychologically manipulated by Sunny Balwani, her former boyfriend and business partner. This became the most contentious part of the trial. Holmes testified that Balwani had controlled aspects of her life, that he'd been emotionally abusive, that his influence had impacted her decision-making. The prosecution argued this was irrelevant to the fraud charges. Holmes was a Stanford-educated CEO who'd made calculated decisions to deceive investors and patients. She wasn't a victim, she was a perpetrator. The jury deliberated for 7 days. In January 2022, they returned a verdict, guilty on 4 counts of defrauding investors, not guilty on charges related to defrauding patients. It was a split verdict, but it was still a conviction. Sunny Balwani was tried separately. He was convicted on all 12 counts of fraud. In November 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. Balwani received 13 years. The sentencing marked the end of one of the most spectacular frauds in Silicon Valley history. But the aftermath raised uncomfortable questions. Holmes's defense team immediately filed appeals. They argued the trial had been unfair. They pointed to alleged government misconduct. They tried every legal avenue to delay or overturn the conviction. In May 2023, while her appeals were pending, Holmes was ordered to begin her prison sentence. She reported to a minimum security federal prison in Texas. Some observers felt the sentence was too harsh. They argued Holmes was being punished more severely because she'd embarrassed powerful people, that white-collar criminals typically receive lighter sentences. Others felt it was too lenient, that 11 years wasn't enough for a fraud that endangered patients and bilked investors out of hundreds of millions of dollars. The debate revealed something about how we view accountability for corporate crime. If Holmes had robbed a bank of a few $1,000s, she'd likely serve serious time. But she'd committed fraud on a massive scale, endangered public health, and leveraged the most powerful connections in America to sustain her lies for over a decade. Is 11 years enough? There's also the question of the enablers, the board members who lent their prestige without due diligence, the investors who threw money at a company without verifying its claims, the media outlets that celebrated Holmes without skepticism, the regulators who failed to catch the problems earlier. Very few of them faced consequences. George Shultz passed away in 2021 before the trial concluded. Before his death, he'd reportedly reconciled with his grandson Tyler, finally believing him about Theranos. Henry Kissinger resigned from the board after the scandal broke. He faced no legal consequences. The investors lost money. Some of them, like Rupert Murdoch, lost over $100 million. But for billionaires, that's survivable. Walgreens settled lawsuits from patients for an undisclosed sum. David Boies, the lawyer who'd helped Theranos intimidate whistleblowers and journalists, faced professional criticism, but no formal consequences. The system had failed at multiple levels, and only 2 people, Holmes and Balwani, ultimately paid the criminal price. But here's the thing about the Theranos story that makes it more than just a historical scandal. The conditions that enabled Theranos still exist. Silicon Valley still celebrates charismatic founders making grandiose promises. Investors still prioritize narrative over evidence. Media still loves disruption stories. Regulators still struggle to keep pace with technology. And that brings us to the final piece of this story. The lesson that Silicon Valley seems unwilling to learn. There's a reason the Theranos story resonates so deeply right now, in 2026. Because we're watching it happen again. Different technology, different founders, but the same pattern. Look at the AI boom that exploded in the last few years. The promises, the hype, the billions in funding, the charismatic CEOs making bold claims about what their technology can do. Look at OpenClaw, the AI agent that became internet famous in early 2026. The parallels are striking. OpenClaw was celebrated as revolutionary, the AI assistant that finally delivered on the promises Siri made back in the 2010s. It could manage your files, book your meetings, shop on your behalf, even invest your money autonomously. Creators and entrepreneurs got excited. They gave OpenClaw access to their computers, their emails, their browsers. They trusted it to handle important tasks. And then the problems started emerging. Just like Theranos, the promise exceeded the reality. OpenClaw was unreliable. It would work perfectly for weeks, then suddenly break. It couldn't distinguish between important files and trash. It fell victim to phishing scams and prompt injection attacks. One high-profile case involved a Meta AI safety researcher who had all her emails deleted by an OpenClaw agent. A social media platform where only AI agents were allowed turned into chaos when the bots developed their own bizarre behaviors, possibly even starting a religion and potentially getting users hacked. The technology wasn't ready, but it had been released at scale anyway. Sound familiar? There's a quote from AI pioneer Geoffrey Hinton that perfectly captures the problem. He called current AI systems idiot savants that don't understand truth or maintain consistent worldviews. That's exactly what Elizabeth Holmes was, an idiot savant, brilliant at fundraising, at cultivating relationships, at crafting narratives, but fundamentally detached from truth. And Silicon Valley funded her for over a decade. The pattern repeats because the incentives haven't changed. Venture capital firms still make money by finding the next unicorn, not by ensuring technologies actually work. They throw money at charismatic founders with compelling stories, hoping 1 in 10 bets pays off massive returns. The 9 that fail? That's just the cost of doing business. Founders still know that overselling is rewarded, that generating hype is more valuable than achieving results, that if you can raise enough money fast enough, you can paper over the problems long enough to either succeed or exit wealthy. Media outlets still prioritize clicks over investigation. A story about a revolutionary young founder gets more engagement than a dry, technical analysis explaining why the technology probably doesn't work. And regulators? They're always years behind. The FDA still struggles with oversight of medical AI. The SEC still can't effectively evaluate technical claims in startup pitch decks. This creates an environment where fraud isn't just possible, it's incentivized. There are crucial differences between Theranos and something like OpenClaw. OpenClaw is open source, which provides transparency Theranos never had. The AI community is generally more willing to publicly discuss failures and limitations, but the underlying dynamic is the same. Technology released before it's safe, promises that exceed capabilities, users trusting systems that aren't trustworthy. And make no mistake, there are AI companies right now making Theranos-level claims, promising capabilities they haven't achieved, raising money on vaporware, hoping they'll figure it out before anyone notices. Some will succeed, some won't. Some will quietly shut down, and some will blow up spectacularly. The question is whether we'll catch them before they cause real harm. Because that's the other lesson from Theranos. The harm was real. Patients received incorrect medical results. Some made health decisions based on faulty data. The full extent of the damage will never be known because Theranos fought to keep it hidden. What's the AI equivalent? What happens when people trust AI agents with critical decisions, and those agents make catastrophic mistakes? We're already seeing glimpses. AI systems providing medical advice that contradicts established science, AI agents making financial trades that lose money, AI chatbots in mental health applications giving dangerous advice. None of it has reached Theranos-level catastrophe yet, but the trajectory is concerning. And here's the most frustrating part. We know how to prevent this. We have frameworks for evaluating technology before deploying it at scale. Medical devices go through rigorous testing. Drugs go through clinical trials. Even cars have safety standards. But software, especially AI software, faces minimal regulation. It can be released to millions of users without any meaningful oversight. The argument is always the same. Regulation will stifle innovation. If we slow down, China will win the AI race. If we impose requirements, startups will die. Those arguments work politically. They don't work medically or ethically. The Theranos story should have been a wake-up call. It should have triggered comprehensive reform in how we evaluate and regulate health technology startups. Instead, it became a compelling Netflix documentary and a cautionary tale that everyone claims to have learned from, but nobody actually